participation that we did as Pharma during a number of different events that were held by APEC last year, including really providing some industry perspectives during the policy dialogue sessions, lessons in innovation and regulatory convergence from beyond APEC, where we participated hand in hand with regulators from Brazil and Colombia, as well as James Fitzgerald from PAHO. And throughout all of these discussions, there was, clearly agreement by our member companies, by us, by the APEC team, that there's awesome opportunities to take advantage of APEC activities in the region, particularly around the regulatory arena. And there's, an opportunity to collaborate with stakeholders to promote APEC centers of excellence, training programs, and different financing schemes. And I think since I had the opportunity to participate in those events, as well as others from Pharma, really want to support the RHSC in its future collaboration and coordination with non-APEC economies. And so, regulatory harmonization is something that kind of is really in line with the mission that I always talk about, which is, how do we get better patient outcomes and how do we create more sustainable healthcare systems? And I think regulatory harmonization is one of the ways in which we can do that. And so I think we can play an important role, and this webinar is part of that, in improving outreach and communication about what APEC is doing in Latin America, as well as, kind of making sure that what the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee is doing is well connected with other, regulatory conversion initiatives, including PANDRA, which is, led by PAHO, and where, Pharma has a permanent seat. So I think that, we want to act as an interlocutor for APEC in the region, supporting regulatory convergence and the trading initiatives that are being led by APEC. And we are very interested in making sure that we can develop some centers of excellence in the region. And I do think it's a little bit disappointing, given some of the quality of the institutions that we have regionally, that, one of the great initiatives that APEC has had good results with, which is the centers of excellence, is not something that we have on the ground just yet, but we'll make sure that we get there. And I think this is a good first step. The webinar is a good first step to help start executing on that strategy, and it's a good opportunity for people to learn a little bit more about APEC, around regulatory convergence, capacity building efforts, and I'm gonna hand it over to Camila here in just a second, but wanted to just give you guys a quick overview of the agenda. We're gonna be joined here by our friends from CMI, Patty and Eric. We're gonna talk a little bit about the Life Sciences Innovation Forum and APEC. We're gonna hear about the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee from Camille, and then Jared is going to talk a bit about how these kind of centers of excellence work, and then we'll have an opportunity for some discussion. So with that, I wanted to see Camila. Is there anything that you'd want to mention, since you're clearly one of the people leading our initiatives around regulatory for Pharma? Camila Gomez.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And I guess on behalf also of Cristina and Sonia and Lorena, those of us who have worked on a APEC regulatory strategy, would like to thank you for participating in this webinar, and thank Rafael for the kind introductory words. I think this is it. Let's make the most of this possibility that is given to us to collaborate with our APEC colleagues. And we have a very good panel today for the discussion. So I'm happy to see that everything worked quite well. Thank you.
Great. So with that, why don't we pass it over to Patty and Eric to continue on the agenda.
Hi everyone, Eric here from Washington, D.C. I'll be talking a little bit about just an introduction to APEC and the APEC Life Sciences Innovation Forum, for those who aren't as familiar with sort of the larger apparatus that is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Next slide. Next slide. So in essence, the APEC mission statement is to be the premier Asia-Pacific Economic Forum. I'm so excited to be on this webinar today and to hear all of the great work that FIFARMA has already done in the wake of what was a terrific set of meetings last year in Chile, to really think about a deeper and more consistent style of engagement in Latin America moving forward. I think that's part of what makes APEC unique, is this bridge between Asia and Latin America, both of which, of course, border the Pacific Ocean. APEC as a whole is united in their drive to build a dynamic and harmonious community. That means championing free and open trade and investment, which is really where APEC started, and has branched out into larger questions and solutions to regional economic integration, economic and technical cooperation, human security, which includes things like pandemic preparedness, food security, health, of course, global health security, and lastly, facilitating a favorable and sustainable business environment. Really what's core to APEC is this notion of collaboration between governments, industry, and academic experts. And all of these various initiatives that are happening in APEC, which are much broader than the ones that we're focused on here today in the health and life sciences, all of them are united in this goal to turn, to create concrete results and agreements and to really drive benefits. Next slide, please. So this is just a look at some of the APEC economies, all 21 of them. And if you'll note that we're very careful about nomenclature. What many of you know as Taiwan is referred to as Chinese Taipei. China is the People's Republic of China. Vietnam is spelled with 2 words. Those are intricacies and sort of nuances of the APEC process. It's what was required to get all of these 21 economies working together under the APEC Forum as independent economies. So you'll see Hong Kong, China, Chinese Taipei. Those both participate independently of China, as you all know, operate largely independent economies, which are so vital for all of our industries. And then, of course, on the other side, you have the participation of Canada, the United States, Mexico, Peru, and Chile. Next slide, please. So by the numbers, the APEC scope is really quite staggering. And we've seen a remarkable increase in just the extent to which APEC covers global population, global trade by volume, global GDP, and the growth rate since APEC's founding in the late 80s. Over that time, we've also seen a number of remarkable benefits, economic benefits, including reduction in tariffs, increase in trade volume, jobs increase, reduction in poverty, cost savings, and reduction in costs associated with the movement of goods and services. Next slide, please. So to the matter at hand, our firm, Crowell & Moring International, was involved back in 2002 with the help of the heads of state, the APEC leaders, in establishing the Life Sciences Innovation Forum. Since 2002, we've really become APEC's leading platform to discuss issues on health, the economy, and innovation. And I would argue that this platform, the Life Sciences Innovation Forum, has really become one of the world's leading platforms to discuss this issue. We've seen a number of other platforms in other regions start to have a conversation around the nexus of health and the economy. This notion that we not only should be talking to health ministers, but also finance ministers. That's a concept that APEC was largely on the forefront of. Important to note that APEC LSIF is a tripartite forum. So we engage the highest levels of government, industry leaders like all of you, and academic experts. We see all of those stakeholder groups as integral to creating the right policy environment for health and life sciences innovation. We're also having some very interesting and promising conversations about the role of patient groups and patients. You'll notice that they're not included here. Up until this point, patients, of course, have always been seen as an important stakeholder group, but technically not included in sort of the tripartite, the three different stakeholder groups. That may change in the future, so we're having some really good conversations around the role of patients, which have really been born out of the LSIF work on rare diseases. The two flagship initiatives of the LSIF are the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee, which we're here to talk about today, and also the high-level meeting on health and the economy. The HLM is sort of the eminent platform to gather the highest levels of all of the stakeholder groups that are involved. Business executives, oftentimes your commercial or public affairs vice presidents or even C-suite members, and health ministers, sometimes deputy health ministers, and the academic experts from the region. Next slide, please. Other LSIF workshops and policy dialogues to note, many of which have links and bridges to our work on regulatory convergence, include healthcare financing, antimicrobial resistance, and I'm particularly excited about some conversations within this work stream on getting creative about antibiotic development. As we all know, has been really sort of a challenging market dilemma, so figuring out how we can bring new antibiotics to market. Work on vaccines and immunization. There's work going on HPV and cervical cancer, which as of this year, we're looking to expand that to other HPV-associated cancers. We have some brand new work on digital health and trade. We have ongoing work on rare diseases, which has really sort of been one of our outstanding initiatives within the LSIF, which has gained quite a bit of traction since 2017. We're doing some work on latent tuberculosis, attracting investment in clinical trials, and the biopharmaceutical supply chain and quality standards. So as you can see, all of these connect to what is, as I mentioned, one of our flagship initiatives, the RHSC, focused on regulatory convergence of medical products. And that includes, as you'll hear from Camille and Leela in a little bit, that of course includes pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and within pharmaceuticals, a whole range of different products and therapeutic areas. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the LSIF is represented by a number of government stakeholders. All of this work is sort of coordinated by a planning group, which meets at SOM 1 and SOM 3. And participants at the planning group include not only ministries of health, but those regulatory agencies that are part of RHSC, as well as ministries of science and technology and foreign affairs and trade. Both of which oftentimes have some input into the issues that we're talking about. Next slide, please. This is just a schematic of the reporting structure and the organizational structure of the LSIF. I won't go too deep into it, but note that the RHSC there reports to the LSIF Planning Group, which is led by the United States. The RHSC is co-chaired by Michelle Lamoli of USFDA and Nobumasa Nakashima from Japan, PMDA. Next slide, please. And as foreshadowed, the other LSIF representatives include academia, industry from those various industry verticals, and patient groups. And like I said, we're working on sort of how we can potentially get more of a formal representation for patient groups in the LSIF. And that means potentially an RHSC as well. To note that all the non-government participation in LSIF, including RHSC, is coordinated by the LSIF Secretariat's Office, which Crowell & Moring International functions as the LSIF Secretariat. Next slide, please. So very briefly, the high-level meeting, as I mentioned before, this is a joint initiative with the APEC Health Working Group, which is the all-government forum, the other health forum in APEC, but only government officials. And so the HLM becomes sort of a joint effort between LSIF and the Health Working Group. In the past, we've dealt with issues like primary health care in Papua New Guinea in 2018. Last year in Chile, we were focused on healthy aging. And this year, we're expecting the HLM in Malaysia to focus on health disparities and really getting back to that core competency of LSIF, which is the nexus between health and the economy. How can we use health as a driver to keep our populations healthy and therefore productive and really drive growth in our economies? At the end of the HLM, we issue a joint statement which has the powerful political backing of the health ministers and the senior level economic and trade officials that attend. This joint statement recognizes a number of the initiatives that we're working on in LSIF, a number of the initiatives that the Health Working Group is working on separately and sometimes in collaboration with LSIF, and certainly the RHSC also will have a paragraph in the joint statement. Most recently last year, that paragraph talks about how the LSIF and Health Working Group are looking forward to the new Vision 2030 and strategic framework, which we hope to have endorsed at SOM1 next month. Next slide, please. At this point, I know I'm running a little bit short on time, but if there's any questions, I can take them now if they're brief, and perhaps there'll be time later on for questions as well.
I think that was a great overview, Eric. Really appreciate you walking us through both the history and a little bit of the context. Why don't we now deep dive more into the RHSC, and then we'll see how questions develop.
Camille?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, you can start now. Anytime.
Okay, so we're sending it over to you and Leela.
Perfect. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Camille Jackson. I'm an Associate Vice President at PhRMA in our Science and Regulatory Advocacy Department. And just in looking at the number of participants here, I want to just say that I recognize a number of names, and so I'm happy to engage with you here through this PhRMA forum. For this presentation, going over the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee under the APEC LSIF, I'll be joined by Leila Faizi from Bio. We will be jointly presenting this presentation. I'll start, and then about midway through, I'll hand this over to my colleague Leila. So first I'll start by saying that in terms of my capacity, in terms of representing pharma in APEC, I share the responsibility of representing the Innovative Biopharmaceutical Industry Coalition in the RHSC, and I share that responsibility with actually the Japan Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, JPMA. And so the coalition that I represent is jointly chaired by both pharma as well as JPMA. I just wanted to make that point clear. And so next slide. Okay, so for today's agenda, we've just outlined some of the areas that we'll cover, an outline of the RHSC itself, as well as going over the strategic framework of the RHSC. And then once I've gone over those two items, I'll hand the baton over to Leila, who will cover the RHSC's priority work areas, their roadmaps, as well as core curriculum, as well as how those things are organized and the stakeholders involved, and then going into a relatively new initiative that RHSC has championed around key performance indicators, measuring regulatory convergence in the APEC regions, and elevating some of the key messages up through the APEC structure. Next slide. And next slide. Perfect. So the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee under the Life Sciences Innovation Forum was established in June of 2009 under the auspices, again, of the LSIF, really to promote a strategic framework around regulatory convergence, with the idea that there's already a number of initiatives out there in the world that have been in existence for quite some time by 2009. But the idea was to really focus some key initiatives under APEC that could really accelerate some of the work for the APEC economies. In order to do this, the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee formed a network of regulatory experts from regulatory agencies in the APEC economies, as well as industry and academia. Again, going back to the tripartite organization of APEC. And the idea was to design a complementary role for APEC to play in relation to some of the other international regulatory initiatives. And we've outlined some of them here on this slide, notably ICH, which I will also disclose. I represent pharma in ICH as well as the IMDRF, the Medical Device Harmonization Forum, the WHO, as well as the International Pharmaceutical Regulator Program, which has recently issued in the last few years guidance for cell and gene therapies, but it also covers areas, for example, like generic drug products as well. And the idea is that all of this would align under the RHSC and then report back into the LSIF and then the broader APEC framework. Next slide. So this slide really kind of goes into APEC's aligned understanding and promotion of the notion of regulatory convergence, really making the distinction between convergence and harmonization. And hopefully this is a slide that a number of you have seen. This is something that was published by Professor John Lim from Singapore, who heads up a number of initiatives, in particular one that aligns to APEC. But essentially it outlines the definition that APEC has adopted for regulatory convergence, which is that over time, regulatory requirements will become more aligned, and making the distinction between convergence versus harmonization. Harmonization really kind of thinking back to individual regions adopting the same requirements practically at the same time, if you will, to promote harmonized regulatory requirements and frameworks, but recognizing that there is a distinct national, legislative, demographic, and risk tolerance factors that ultimately go into the regulation of medical products that each country or economy takes on. The idea of convergence was thought that this is something that APEC could take on. It could drive through a number of ways, and that over time, regulatory frameworks would become more and more similar with the adoption of internationally recognized technical guidance documents, standards, and scientific principles. Next slide. So next I'll go through the strategic framework of the RHSC. Next slide. And so there are two high-level goals that really make up the strategic framework. One is to provide the basic proposal and rationale for achieving regulatory convergence for medical products by 2020. This was a goal that was set out by the RHSC itself to achieve as much as possible by 2020. And what do you know, we have arrived here. And later on in the presentation, we will go over some of the key performance indicators to demonstrate progress in achieving that goal. And the second is a little bit more tactical, which is to outline a strategic multi-year approach for meeting this goal in support of the broader objectives of improved public health and economic development. Next slide. And so starting from the top, the idea was that the RHSC, through a coordinated framework, could promote regulatory convergence through the formation of what the RHSC has called priority work areas, and aligned to a number of very key topics that cut across regulatory frameworks in a number of different economies, both within the APEC framework as well as outside of the APEC framework. And in order to do that, needs assessments would be done, and then roadmaps would be developed for promoting best practices through a partnership with regulators, industry, as well as academia. And then from those priority work areas, individual projects as part of a strategy would be launched to contribute to the overall goals. And the idea was that instead of APEC launching ad hoc or individual proposals, workshops, or initiatives, the idea was, again, to promote this coordinated approach, a single way of working that would translate and hopefully scale over time in a number of key areas to promote regulatory convergence over time across a number of APEC as well as non-APEC economies over time. Next slide. And so in setting up this framework, going back to 2011 and 2012, the idea was to set a foundation by building capacity and procedures for developing and implementing regulatory best practices. And in order to draw on the broader APEC efforts in setting that foundation for robust regulatory systems that are science-based, transparent, effective, and predictable in terms of what APEC could do under these auspices. Each APEC economy that's operating in the RHSC would have the ability to become a topic champion. And essentially the role and responsibility there would be to help lead the convergence efforts. And they would essentially serve as the primary author of a tailored roadmap leading to regulatory convergence. In terms of administrative as well as other kinds of support, the APEC Harmonization Center that's currently supported by South Korea would help support the RHSC's efforts in executing these roadmaps through targeted training programs, research, as well as other measures. Next slide. So after setting this foundation, we would enter into phase 2, and a lot of this work for a number of the priority work areas took place in 2013 through 2015. And really the idea was to evaluate the proposed training programs on the basis on how they would improve participants' ability to implement the recommended best regulatory practices in key areas in each sector, essentially to determine the level of convergence they seek and inform the RHSC of gaps that they would like to address through APEC capacity building initiatives, such again as workshops that would be facilitated by the tripartite effort of regulators, industry, as well as academia. And then from 2015 to 2020, a number of these priority work areas, working under their priority work areas, essentially encouraged participating economies to voluntarily complete a readiness assessment on their individual progress towards the goals they have set for themselves in developing a regulatory system that converges with international best practices. And so this is what has been going on for the last 5 years or so, recognizing that a number of these priority work areas were set towards the beginning of this 10-year span, but some have actually launched, some new priority work areas have launched recently and do not necessarily align to this timeline, but this is in general the framework that has been put forward and the general timeline that a number of these initiatives have followed. Next slide. Okay, so with that, I'll hand this back to Leila, my colleague from Bio, to take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Leila Faizi, and I'm Vice President for International Affairs at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and I've been involved in the APEC RHSC beginning in 2012. As the capacity as the Biotechnological Products Coalition Coordinator. So let me dive into a little bit what some of the RHSC priority work areas are, their roadmap, and the core curriculum. So if you look at this particular slide, you see that as Camille mentioned, the various economies have the opportunity to champion specific roadmaps. So what these champions will do generally, what they've done is they establish a roadmap in a particular priority work area. They pull together a core curriculum. They identify various centers of excellences that are able to carry out the training of the core curriculum. And these centers of excellences will have the same curriculum. They'll provide training seminars for promoting the various regulatory convergence capacity in cooperation with the priority work areas. But the key here is that the curriculum that each one of these centers of excellences implements is the same in terms of the basic curriculum itself. So once the champions have developed the roadmap, that roadmap is endorsed by the RHSC as well as the core curriculum. So everything that the champions do in the priority work area has to be endorsed by the RHSC. And then and anything that the centers of excellences do in terms of training, if there's any modifications to any of the trainings, and the selection actually and the approval of the centers of excellences are also done by the RHSC. Next slide. Okay, so here are some of the work areas that the RHSC is currently involved in. As you can see, there is a work area in multi-regional clinical trial and GCP inspection, has 2 champion economies. There's pharmacovigilance, biotherapeutics, advanced therapies, which currently right now, advanced therapies focuses on cell and gene therapy, but because of the breadth of the term, of the phrase advanced therapies, it leaves open in the future for other types of novel therapies to be included under this, apparently. So, but currently the work being done is in the area of, cell and gene therapy. And just a modification to the champions, recently the RHSC approved the ability of industry to also be a co-champion, although the lead of the of each roadmap must be a regulatory authority. So with respect to advanced therapies, Singapore and bio are both co-champions. So there should be a modification to this particular slide. We also have good registration management, global supply chain integrity, and medical devices, which just recently in the past year, a year and a half or so, has really taken off much more. Prior to that, there wasn't that much in terms of guidances or harmonized guidances that could be applied, but apparently now there is much more in the area of medical devices, and so that area has picked up significantly as well. Next slide, please. We mentioned the centers of excellences that have been identified by the specific, roadmap champions. And as of March 22nd, 2019, you can see that there's a variety of different centers of excellences. Some are academic institutions, and others are, standard setting bodies. You have U.S. Pharmacopoeia, for example, RAPS. So and also even regulatory agencies can be centers of excellences. So there's a whole host of possibilities. Essentially, the criteria, the main criteria is that the institution or the entity be capable of doing the training. So whatever that entity may be. So it's quite open to different types of organizations. And I believe that since the advanced therapies roadmap has also started to move forward, there have been additional, the Duke NUS, I believe, is also, and Eric, please correct me if I'm wrong, is also now a COE for advanced therapies, as well as Northeastern University. So I think there is, in that particular space, there are also COEs available. Okay, next slide, please. So I think, the main goal of the centers of excellence is obviously is to try and move together, to bring to convergence the APEC economies, and so there has to be some sort of a measurement to that. It's not sufficient just to do the training, because that's actually the first part of it, but clearly, you need to assess to see whether that training has done has had any impact. And so the APEC RHSC identified key performance indicators to measure regulatory convergence in the APEC region. And in this slide, you can see some of the overall key performance indicators that were identified. Specifically, if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, the group decided that looking to see whether, assess the PIC's membership, how many of the APEC regulatory authorities were members of PIC prior to 2018, and then post 2018. Also another key performance indicator is becoming an ICH full member. Another was the change of one site to multi-site in a single license. And then the fourth was the removal of CPPs. So if you look to see, and so the assessment was made in that regard. And I think probably the best way for us to sort of visualize this is if we, so there was a survey that was done. If we move to the next slide, please. There was a survey that was done, and of the 21 economies, we did get responses from 18 economies. And here is where I think we could, if we could switch over to another slide that is not in this particular slide deck, and that is the infographic for the key performance indicator. Do you have that available by any chance? That might be a better way of sort of looking at this. Do you have that by any chance?
Sorry, what do you need?
It's the key performance indicator. It's the infographic. It's a separate, yeah, it's a separate slide.
Okay, I will share it now.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's just a little bit easier to sort of walk through it that way. Okay. Thank you. If you could scroll down a little bit, you can go into, okay, yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so if we look at this slide, some of the things that we looked at in terms of you know, where industry was, sorry, not industry, where the regulatory authorities were, starting from 2 time points, in 2008 and 2019. Because 2008 was prior to the beginning of the RHSC, and 2019 was the date of the assessment. We looked to see where there were changes, where there were specific changes that were made in behavior. And if you look to see, the areas that we assessed were information sharing, establishing confidentiality commitments, sharing good manufacturing practices, GMP certificates, establishing mutual recognition agreements, minimizing requirements for a certificate of pharmaceutical products, allowing multiple sites in a single license. And if you look to see in all of those areas, you had an increase. So you had movement towards convergence after you know, obviously the beginning of the trainings, and also the beginning of the implementations of the roadmaps. You scroll down just a little bit more. Okay. And if you look, we had talked about the PICS and ICH membership. Those are, if you look down below, you'll see that you know, you have more of the regulatory authorities in the region becoming members of ICH, and more and becoming members of PICS, and also now in the there's activity and engagement in the IPRP. So the trend post APEC, you know, post APEC RHSC initiatives is moving in the direction of convergence. And this is actually, this infographic that you see is a very tangible measure of what APEC has been able to do. We think that it's something that can be replicated in other regions as well. And the roadmap that APEC has put together is very, very well set forth, and clearly the data and the evidence of effectiveness is clear here. Another thing that I wanted to just point out very quickly is that the centers of excellences that we have there, as of in 2019, as of 2019, we have 12 centers of excellences across 7 APEC economies, and they are hosting 23 workshops. Actually, they hosted 23 workshops in 2019 and trained hundreds of regulators. So this, the amount of work that's being done in APEC is not theoretical, but very, very tangible. So I think with that, I'll stop in case there's any questions.
So just a quick comment. I think that worth mentioning, as you mentioned, centers of excellence, and we may talk about it here in just a second. Even though they're only in 7 member economies and no member economy in Latin America, they are doing projects. I'm sure Jared will talk about it when he talks next in the agenda in the region, right? So it's not like the region is not being touched by any of this work being done by the centers of excellence. It's just that right now we don't have any centers of excellence that are actually based in the region. So I guess, like I said, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But
that's correct.
Any other questions or comments for Camille or Lila? Okay, so it's a good segue for the presentation from Jared on the COEs.
Great, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, I'm Jared O'Clair. I am a faculty member and director at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, as well as the Center of Excellence Coalition co-chair or co-coordinator, if you will. And it's my pleasure this afternoon to tell you about the APEC Centers of Excellence for Regulatory Science. On this first slide, of course, is the most important thing, which is my email address. And I encourage you to email me anytime to discuss training opportunities as well as any other ways that we can help support you in the Latam region. Next slide. So quickly, we'll look at these areas this afternoon. So hopefully we'll leave some time for some questions at the end. I'll briefly go over the operating model and guidelines for the Centers of Excellence, the current network of Centers of Excellence, and then I'll give you an example of one Center of Excellence, which I know best, which is a Northeastern Center of Excellence. I think it's important to note that I think APEC, RHSC, in this region of harmonization towards training or with training, has really been a leader in developing these Centers of Excellence and executing them within the APEC region, but also across the globe, and other organizations using that as a model moving forward. That said, it's still a new model and evolving. So the operating model is a living document that we update regularly. Officially, I think we're going to update it once a year to keep it from being too confusing. So with that, let's look at the operating model. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I think from my perspective, when we think about regulatory convergence, and I'm stealing this from ICH, if we want to go fast, we should go alone. If we want to go far, we should go together. And that's part of the reason why myself personally am involved in these training efforts, because I think working all together, we can go far. And it's a really great opportunity for industry, academia, and government to come together and really move the needle forward, all keeping the patient in mind, right? Patients first is my motto. Next slide. So the operating model considers key stakeholders in the process. Of course, the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee is at the center that reports back up to the Life Sciences Innovation Forum, the World Health Organization, IPRF, IMDRF, and ICH all inform what we do at the RHSC, which then of course informs the training centers of excellence for regulatory science. So those things, or these training centers, as Leila mentioned, don't exist in a vacuum and have a core curriculum that we teach against. We definitely don't want the training to promote divergence. We want it to promote convergence. So we need to make sure that we're all aligned and on the same page. Next slide, please. So like I said, it's an evolving model. There's centers of excellence in all of the key priority work areas, which are listed here on the slide on the left, and you've heard of them already, so we won't go into them. So how does a COE sort of come into operation? So the priority work area has champions, as you've heard, and underneath that champion economy is a steering committee. That steering committee helps guide the priority work area champions in doing their work and developing the core curriculum. They will also then identify centers of excellence host institutions, or centers of excellence host institutions will find that priority work area and express interest. They'll do a pilot program, and before they execute that pilot, they'll convene a program committee. Program committee is for each specific center of excellence, and its goal is to obviously develop the program and help guide that center of excellence to execute the training curriculum that's been developed by the steering committee. Once the pilot's been completed, they'll report those results to the RHSC and ask for formal COE endorsement. And then after that, they're able to go ahead and train across the world. Next slide, please. So the objectives are to build skilled human capacity in regulatory sciences, obviously to bring safe, effective, and quality medicines to patients, patients being the key. We want to share our understanding in the science and best practices that we all use, keeping in mind a science-based, risk-based evaluation. Achieve a model of sustainable operation that includes periodic updates to the regulatory relevancy of materials, and we want to avoid duplication, which is one of the key topics I think we're coming to now, and I imagine will be a topic for consideration at the senior official meeting, SOM 1, in a few weeks from now. Next slide, please. There's lots of benefits, right? We can deliver training that's supported by regulatory experts and subject matter experts from industry, academia, and governments. Centers of excellence are financially independent, so they must sustain their own operations so that we can reduce any necessity for APEC funding. They must enable long-term continuous training in the science and best practices of that priority work area. Typically, the memorandum of understanding is 5 years. They are really great at building a regulatory network, which I'll mention in a minute, and promoting a holistic, science-based, risk-based training in, towards that type of review. Next slide, please. So let's look at the current network of COEs. So as Eric showed, this is the map of all the economies in APEC currently. And you can just see yellow stars where I highlighted we have homes of COEs. And if you, as you have heard, we currently don't have any in Latin America, but would love to see some there in the very near future. As a matter of fact, it's one of my main initiatives. So if there's anything I can do to help in that process, I'm happy to do that, including being a co-COE with an interested university or a government agency or other interested party. But really, we have a great network of centers of excellence, and we're now building that network so we can try to ensure that you know, there's good collaboration across the network. Next slide, please. So in the RHSC, all the centers of excellence are part of a COE coalition, which I'm co-chair of and representing today. We share lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work. We share content experts where it's appropriate and allowed. We have a model adapted by other, we use guidelines that are adopted by other organizations to inform our training. But I think, and really what's exciting to me about this webinar today is the ability to think beyond those member economies of APEC and how the work we're doing in APEC can help really drive regulatory convergence across the globe, which is something that I'm passionate about, and I'll talk about on the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So Northeastern is a center of regulatory excellence for biotherapeutics. With a 46 or 48 member program committee, we developed the core curriculum that's outlined here at a really high level. Part one is the introduction to biologics, which is done online to make sure that everybody is aligned before they come to the in-person training. Everybody has the same background. They're required to do that before they come on site, as well as they have 6 months of access after the course ends, and about 60% of the participants are still accessing that material 5 or 5.5 months after the training, and almost 100% of them access it during the training. Part two is comparability throughout the life cycle. So we're looking at the innovator and its comparability, and part three is really focused on assessment for biosimilars. Next slide, please. So we have two models for training. We have training that happens on site. So for me, this would be in Boston at my training center. We convene participants from economies of COE host institutions from all around the world. Regulators from various economies attend. That automatically builds a regulatory network. And we try to scholarship as many regulators as we can through funds that I raise with the help of my colleagues. Our training has hands-on experiential learning, which is a cornerstone of all Northeastern education, and allows for smaller class size and more interaction with the faculty. The other opportunity that we do take advantage of is in-country training. So we take our training on the road. As a matter of fact, I've been to Latin America and done training for ISP in Chile. I've done training for Anvisa in Brazil a few times, and I'm looking to support training efforts in Latam moving forward. So any country where it's safe for me to travel, I would love to go and help train, including supporting potential centers of excellence from the region. I want to bring, so we bring back one slide, please. So we bring the training to the economy. We bring the regulators. All those costs for me are covered by our training center. There's no cost to the regulatory authority. If we train industry while we're there, we do charge a small fee. So there's a larger number of participants, which could allow for a larger impact and personalized to the region or economy that we're in, which is also important. And I recommend taking advantage of both, which lots of economies do. We'll do the in-country training, and then they'll send a few key regulators to Boston in my training center to help strengthen that background, especially the hands-on training part. Next slide. Here are just a couple of pictures from some of our trainings. Here's a case study at the top that the class is working on. These are regulators from all over the world, from Cofepris to Thailand to the Philippines and other economies. But they come into the training and they're all very shy and quiet and don't interact with each other very much. And by the end of the training, they're all best friends. And when I travel and I see them again or train elsewhere, it's great to hear that most of them stay in contact and have built their own sort of little regulatory network that we're trying to expand on. And of course, there's a couple of pictures of the chalk talk and lab work. The regulators find the hands-on training really valuable because they get a first-hand look at how some of the data is collected and for dossiers that they're seeing. And we are strong proponents of online training throughout all the COEs where possible. And if we're in country, we can do that remotely through AR and VR and other opportunities. Next slide, please. So again, here's my contact information, which I hope you'll take advantage of and reach out to me. I'd love to work with your companies to help promote training in the region, or have folks come out to us. All of our faculty for these centers of excellence in the coalition tend to be industry experts or other regulators. So it's really a great opportunity to promote interactions between industry, academia, and government to really build the regulatory network and see what we can do for promoting regulatory conversions around the globe. Thank you.
Great, Jared. Thanks so much for the overview, and it was great having an opportunity to see you in person during the APEC meetings, and you really do have a passion for the region. We really appreciate that, and having you in that co-champion spot means it's a perfect opportunity for us to really push for more of that COE presence in Latin America. So thanks so much for participating as well in the webinar. I think this is, unless Maria Alejandra corrects me, I think this is the part of the agenda where we open it up for Q&A. So I know we've covered a good amount of information. Wanted to give people an opportunity to ask questions or just kind of give us a sense of what they see we can leverage from PFARMA and just broadly in the region.
Hi, Rafael. This is Cristina Mota from APEC. Can I make a question?
Of course, Cristina. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is for Jared. And the question I have, Jared, is while we are mapping potential opportunities for Latam to become centers of excellence, do you have any recommendation of which characteristics you recommend of those entities to be able to be successful at the pilot and then at endorsement by the RHSC? And also, my second question is, does this need to be an economy that's member of APEC, or is there some flexibility there? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions and great questions. So first, I think it's important for people who are interested in being centers of excellence to understand up front that it's a pretty heavy lift in the sense that you have to be financially sustain yourself. You have to financially sustain your own training. RHSC doesn't provide any funds for the COE work that we do. There are APEC funds you can apply for, but it's going to be, if all the centers of excellence apply for them, they would be super competitive, as there, I think Leila mentioned 12, but I'm pretty sure by the end of SOM 1, there's going to be closer to the 20 or 30 active COEs and pilot COEs both. So it's something to keep in mind. Really an organization that has a diverse, broad spectrum of knowledge on the given topical area is really great. Is a really great person to make a COE. We also recommend, academic institutions that have that kind of background, scientific organizations, regulatory authorities can do it, even though I think it's better if they do that in partnership with somebody else. That's just my opinion. That's not the opinion of the COE Coalition. But I also think that people who are interested in becoming a COE should contact me and really take advantage of the COE Coalition to help them guide them through the process. We have a checklist that we've made that can help the institution go from pilot to full COE, help them through the operating model. We're looking at in the future holding a COE boot camp. How do you become a center of excellence effectively, and learning from each other and tips and tricks. It's also good if you can attend the meeting at least once a year. Lots of things happen, maybe not in the actual meeting itself, but definitely on the periphery. And having a good network between your organization and industry and regulators is also important. As of right now, centers of excellence, I believe, have to exist within the APEC region. That's not to say that an APEC center of excellence would have to exist in the APEC region. That's not to say that we can't put COEs elsewhere and have them teach against the APEC curriculum. I think it's an interesting question, and I actually think it's one that would be great for the RHSC to consider moving forward. I think there might be a little pushback from some of the other economies, but one of the things that the COE Coalition is really trying to promote is this webinar is the opportunity to think outside of APEC and what kind of impact the work we're doing in APEC can have on a more global perspective.
Great, thanks, Jared. Thanks, Christina. Any additional questions?
Hello, this is Sonia Vicobueno from Janssen. Do you hear me well?
Hi, this is Camila Gomes. Thanks to all the speakers for the great presentations. I have a question that I guess it's addressed both to Eric, Patricia, Camille, and Leila. For the experience that some of us here in the region have, we have some issues with the continuous engagement from regulators that are APEC economies from the region in the meetings and in the activities. And also now that APEC is also looking beyond the member economies to other Latin countries, I would like to know if you have been discussing possibilities and ways to keep the engagement of those Latin American countries, both the economies that are in APEC and those who are not, how to make it more sustainable to ensure their engagement. Is this an issue that is discussed, or is this an issue at all?
I can start answering. Yeah, this issue of engagement, this is Leela, by the way. This issue of engagement from member economies has been a concern for some time, actually. Not just in the Latin American region, but other parts of the APEC economy, APEC region also have not. Some other parts of the APEC economy, APEC region have not been as engaged. For example, Russia and Australia. So some of these economies we'd like to get involved as well, including getting more of the Latin American economies to be consistently engaged. I think this is something that the APEC RHSC is going to be talking about in more detail and probably try to do a little bit more in 2020. At least that's my understanding from conversations with the co-chairs, because they do want to see more engagement as well. So yeah, it's a concern. We don't have an answer just yet, but it's something that is being discussed with the APEC economies.
And this is Camille. I would just echo exactly what Leela has said. I think that this is definitely something on a number of the APEC RHSC stakeholders' minds. And I think it's entirely possible that we could potentially see by the end of the next 10-year cycle a set of key performance indicators about the growth and the reach of APEC outside of APEC, in particular in Latin America. Again, just to echo that, I think that there are some discussions underway, but I don't think that there's anything more that we could share on behalf of RHSC at this time.
Great, thanks, thanks Leela, thanks Camille. Additional questions?
Hi, this is Rebecca Lumsden from Pfizer. I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about the metrics exercise, because the results look very impressive. Is this something that you see new metrics being put in place once, well, now we're in 2020, or will you be using those metrics to continue to track convergence in the same format at a later date?
I'll start again. I think that there will definitely be an assessment of the key performance indicators for sure. I mean, I think just having in very preliminary conversations, there has been talk about, reliance, for example, as being something to potentially measure as well, because certain of the guidelines, can be, instead of being implemented in the countries, could be relied on. Regulatory authorities could rely on other more sophisticated or regulatory authorities. So that's something that's, I think, preliminarily there's been conversations about that. So I'm sure that there will be changes to, there'll be additions and modifications to the key performance indicators.
Thank you. And I have a second question, if nobody minds. And this one's more to Jared. Listening to what you've been saying about the push to seek centers of excellence, obviously the Latam countries that would be able to do that, if I understood your comments to the earlier question, would be the three that are members of the APEC economies. just to be clear in my own mind, there is still opportunity for non-APEC regulators, for example, to join or leverage existing training that would happen under the current APEC Center of Excellence training. So, for example, a non-APEC regulator could go up to Northeastern and train with you, or you could travel to another market within Latin America, another country.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Exactly right. So it's really up to the Center of Excellence themselves. But speaking for me in Northeastern, yeah, the more people that come to our trainings from around the world, the better. So when we have APEC trainings, we obviously have the APEC economies there, as well as members from Egypt, from Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, etc. So absolutely. Any APEC funds that are used have to be used for the APEC economies. I'll say that. So if you get funds from an organization like the APEC Harmonization Center, it has to be used for members of the APEC economies. But we raise our own funds that allow us to use them for all the economies. And yes, absolutely. I travel to any economy to do training. For example, I've been to Brazil. So if Argentina or Colombia or others were interested in training, I'm happy to go there and support their efforts. Using the APEC curriculum is not an APEC approved training per se, but an APEC curriculum approved training.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Good questions. And I will say that one of the things I've been most impressed with all of the LSIF work is around the KPIs, right? And the ability to make those measurements and hold people accountable for the progress that is being made, or in some cases not being made. And I think that's really key from my perspective to continue to get the outcomes that we've been able to get in APEC, and that I think we could do more of in Latin America. We still have a couple of minutes. Any other questions?
Hello, this is Sonia from Janssen. Do you hear me well?
Yes, go ahead, Sonia.
Well, following up on Rebecca's and Camila's questions, I think it would also be important for this first session, and particularly the audience that we have, some of them trade associations that are closely in contact with regulators in the Latin America countries. I think it would be important to stress the opportunity of having access to the agenda of the COEs that are planned, for example, for 2020, to try to also promote that on a local level and see if we could have more regulator participation in those centers of excellence. That would be perhaps a good starting point. I don't know who is the right one to answer this question. Is it Jared? Do you have already the program for COEs that are going to happen this year on the various topics?
Yeah, great question. I think that the RHSC just launched a website last year. I think it's apec.org/RHSC. Don't quote me. Whatever the APEC webpage is, /RHSC, and we're trying to get all those pieces of information online for you to see. It's a fluid thing that happens. It's often hard to do, but hopefully the information will be there. And of course, you can reach out to me as the co-chair of the COE Coalition, and I can try to provide as much information as possible.
Thanks. And also another clarification, also for the audience, are those courses given in English only, or is there any opportunity for translation into Spanish, Portuguese, for example?
The classes at Northeast, the classes in the home base of the COE are usually given in English. English is the official language of APEC, so we use that. However, if I travel to Brazil or Colombia, or Chile or Asia, or wherever I go, I hire simultaneous translation so that we can have that for the audience on hand at the expense of the Center of Excellence, no cost to the regulators or participants.
Thank you, Jared. I think that's a very important point as well.
Hi, this is Christina. I have another question. So, for example, if there would be an offering in a country, a workshop, how can we engage or make sure the local trade association is aware of the event and can help probably promote this with their people that's in the country?
So if we provide the training within the region, we usually do it in collaboration with trade organizations. So for example, you know, if the Fee Farmer identified, or with all of you identified a region that needed training and wanted to request us to go there, we would work together to put that program on. I would, you know, Northeastern would put on the program and Fee Farmer would help us advertise it and such. We do that around the world. As for other trainings, like if we had a regulator from Peru, from ISP in Chile join our advanced therapies training, obviously they knew about it because of APEC, but we through the RHSC website, and which will hopefully be more current moving forward, but also through talking to the COA Coalition and me, we can keep you updated as often as possible. And I apologize, I have to bounce off. I have a student at my door. So if you have other questions for me, please feel free to email me. I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Jared, thanks so much for participating.
I would just add one thing to that. I know that the co-chairs of the RHSC are in communication with Fee Pharma folks, with you all, and as well as with PAHO. And just wondering if, and that might be a good way to sort of start the coordination on some of these activities. I think that would be probably the best way to get it broadly taken care of, not just on an individual training basis, but if there's like you know, infrastructure set up, that might be able to, you know, direct you all to specific trainings as well. So I highly recommend that this conversation continue with RHSC, PAHO, Fee Pharma, and others that you think are relevant in the region.
And if I may add, this is Camila taking on what Lila just said. We're going to have an opportunity real soon for some of the key players in APEC and in our region to meet. We will have the chair of the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee, Michelle, joining the DIA Latam conference in Miami, where PAHO will be, where Fee Pharma will be also represented. Some of us who are attending this meeting will also be. Jared will be there. And it is our intention to promote, even if informally, a talk to see what are the next steps that would make sense for us to guarantee this continued engagement. We also have some regulators that are going to attend the conference. So I think this is a good venue for us to continue this sort of conversation.
Great, thanks Leila, thanks Camila. I think it's absolutely critical, and I guess, you know, as I commented at the beginning, PAHO is interested in this, and particularly around the COEs, and you know, clearly they should be playing an important role in consolidating the efforts in the region. So making sure that we're including them is very important moving forward.